Okay, I'll be honest with you. I've been sat here trying to figure out how to start this for something like an hour. I've tried about 15 different ways, and my favourite so far has been, "Hey kids, want to hear a spooky story?" Yeah, I'm not exactly the most seasoned of storytellers. I'm not all that smart either, and I'll tell you why. I was 20, and I just flunked out of university. Flunked it like a falcon taking a nosedive through a helicopter's blades. But I wasn't about to tell my parents that. Instead, I elected to keep up the lie until I was supposed to graduate, and then maybe I'd fake my death or something. The only flaw to this plan was that I needed money. I needed money bad. Ever since I realised my degree was taking a turn, I'd been frugal with my cash, but all I had by the end were 3 months of rent if I was careful. I applied to job after job. The only offer I got was from a guy literally calling himself Greasy Benny, who wanted me to run around the neighbourhood catching stray dogs and dropping them in the alley behind his house. I went off it when I saw, quote, "people who would be good for this job. Someone who doesn't ask questions." After 2 months of hunting and counting my change, I was running out of the core ingredients for my gourmet creation, the ketchup sandwich. One night I was on Amazon and started browsing for bubblegum machines under £5 so I could start throwing children's parties. Despite my best efforts, it felt like I was drowning. And then a lifesaver came in the form of an unsolicited 2:30 AM email. The place was called the Starling, a theatre that lay somewhere out in the woods. I never sent them any kind of application. I didn't know the place even existed. I checked all the job agencies I'd signed on to, but not one listed this place. Even a cursory Google search yielded no results. The position they offered me was in hospitality, working the bar, waiting in the restaurant, and serving food. Simple. Well, despite the red flags, I took the interview. It was weird, because the whole thing was over the phone. They didn't really give me a time. So there I am, sat at home as usual, when it rings and I pick up. "What's your previous experience? Why would you be good for this position? How do you overcome challenges? What scares you the most? What's the most you've ever hurt someone? Have you ever been afraid you might disappear? Would anybody miss you?" I could hear their breath struggle up their throat to rattle over the receiver grill, and the sound of lips colliding with tongue on every word. I did my best to answer honestly every question. When he asked the last one, I had to pause, half in shock and half in consideration. Would anybody miss me? I had no reason to even humour such a weird inquiry, but for whatever reason, I told them the honest truth. Probably not. Click. Confusingly, the line went dead, just like that. But I didn't have to wait long to hear back, because next I checked my emails. There it was, ominously waiting for me. The instructions offered assembled to little more than a crude scavenger hunt that would almost undoubtedly end in my horrible demise at the end of a murderous cultist. The instructions offered assembled to little more than a crude scavenger hunt that would almost undoubtedly end with my horrible demise at the hand of murderous cultists, hell-bent on reviving some eldritch abomination with low standards in its sacrifices. I decided that I was kind of fine with that, and so, one Thursday afternoon, in the wintry depths of December, I eagerly journeyed into the woods. A journey from which I, unknowing at the time, would never return. And so, I followed the western footpath up to the old oak tree, took a left and walked straight, until I hit the gravestones that markings had long since rubbed off, followed the crook until it dipped away into the and followed the dilapidated fence to the gate labelled, quote, the Starling. Enter on formal invite only. And under that, in smaller letters, trespassers cannot be accounted for. Treading through the thick brush without even a hint of a path, I found myself outside the doors of a very real and surprisingly well kept, considering it sat in the middle of nowhere, theatre. Considering all that, I suppose the events that followed can only be called my fault. I found myself waking up this morning, looking around me at the walls coated in crisscrossed scratches and the occasional claw mark, and thinking, how the hell did I end up here? To save us some time, I'll start from the beginning of the end. I'd been working at the Starling for 1 year and 9 months, ignoring my hiatus, which I'll explain when I've got more time. I'd met so many fresh, perplexed starters in my time that I worked out my introductory spiel to a T. If you're going to work here, there's a few things you should know. First, you can't leave. I know the wide open double doors out in the lobby look terribly inviting, but trust me, it ain't worth it. Secondly, while we're in the subject of places not to go, the 3rd floor is out of bounds. That's where head office is located. I don't know what's up there. Sam, the hospitality manager, doesn't know what's up there, and whatever the milky red substance that reeks of raw steak with a strange hint of barbecue sauce that occasionally leaks through the ceiling panels is, it's best left ignored. Just jam a bucket down and pretend you didn't see it. Once the doors have opened and the customers start coming in 2.5 hours before the night's performance, you don't come out from behind the bar. Sure, you can head into the kitchen, sit in the cake store, or play a round of squash in the cake store for all I care, but you don't go out into the foyer, no matter how much one of them tries to convince you. When you first see a customer, don't scream or throw anything. I know that it's weird how they don't have faces, but you get used to it. Just serve them like you would any regular person with a face, and try to upsell some nuts if you can. They're starting to go stale. If you smoke, there's a machine in the green room and a smoking area outside fire exit 8. The boundaries of it are clearly marked. Don't stick so much as a finger outside, unless you want to keep it. On the subject of fire exits, in the event of a fire, call stage door on 356 and then quietly wait to be burned alive because we can't escape. While the shows are in progress, get to restocking the upstairs and downstairs bar while clearing the foyers. And for the love of God, don't try and sneak a look into the auditorium. Well, that's probably about all for the major stuff. Do you know how to use a coffee machine? I mean, at different points there were little amendments added and rescinded. Don't look at the mirror in dressing room B. If you see that spider thing near the coffee beans, please catch the bugger. We've had to place 3 orders just this week. But otherwise, that's the stuff that stayed pretty consistent. Let's say it's a pretty normal night, and you found yourself one of the unfortunate newbies. At the time, you'd likely have found one of the handful of bartenders standing with you on the front lines. Perhaps Ash would shoot you a cocky smile as he watched you fight with the cider line, trying your very best to figure out if the piece of crap fast pour taps work better when you hold the cup at an angle or flat against the bottom of the glass as directed. It's possible Lily would be bouncing back and forth from one customer to another with all the enthusiasm of an old bar rag dropped behind the fridge a millennia ago. You might even have been unfortunate enough to be in the bar with Lucas, who would likely be asking you taxing questions on the fabric of reality or how dirty a piece of cutlery would have to be before you clean it. Either way, you'd likely be on the bar with one of the team leaders, which would refer to Connie or I. Likelihood is, you'd ask us the same questions every newbie does. First being, why don't we just close the bar and not serve at all? And I tell you to shut up and to do your job. You be kind, courteous, and no matter what, you do not, for the love of God, stop serving. No matter what Sam and I are screaming at the top of our lungs. Doesn't matter if a griffin leaps over the bar and begins a sparring match with one of your fellow bartenders. You keep serving. because things, as they only ever do in this place, get worse if you stop serving. Things always get worse. And, depending on when you started, you might have been unlucky enough to be there when Mikey from Tech ran into our kitchen screaming bloody murder and begging for help while clutching wildly at his pant leg. You'd, of course, keep serving. You always keep serving. But if you weren't, you might have caught Kanye and I rapidly trying to bandage the lower calf that refused to stop simply swelling and swelling until it roughly resembled a watermelon the colour of raw steak. That is, until it violently exploded, showering the room and its occupants with grisly viscera. As I came out of shock, I roughly remember seeing Connie desperately bandaging little more than bone as the floor pulled with what had, until moments ago, occupied Mikey's veins. You'd have watched as we each came to the same slow and simultaneous conclusion. We were all quiet, serving on the bar for the rest of the night. Still don't know what caused that. And then we'd be closing down for the night, wiping down the tables, when you'd spot something outside amongst the rusting cars that never move, some upturned or with windows smashed. You'd spot something just outside of where the light reaches, and you'd ask yourself what it is. And I'd take my flashlight and point it out into the dark to see one of my old friends or acquaintances, their skin pallid and eyes staring into the light of our foyer. And I would tell you, that's why you don't go outside. Then we'd just finish shutting the bar shutters, and they'd stand out amongst the wrecks, just twitching and undulating, as they do. And when we reached the end of the night, I'd write a few bottles of spirits onto the wastage record, maybe a few wines or perhaps a barrel of lager, and drag it down to the hall. Sometimes we use the place for overflow when we've got too many casts for the dressing rooms, but mostly it's one of the only places of respite we have. Amongst the tables and chairs will likely be tech staff, some box office, and almost certainly me. All of us getting comfortably mashed before calling it a night. And I'll be the last man standing. Always am. Or sitting, sometimes crawling. Last one though. And if you were to be a newbie around this time, you'd have been privy to it all. You'd have been able to watch everything get slowly worse, as it always does. Piece of advice. If you ever get a job offer at some weird place out in the woods, regardless of how desperate you are, don't take it. It's not worth the hassle. The first time I met Jason Warren was when I was partnered with him for a school project. I'd moved to the area a few months prior, and when our teacher gave out the list of partners, the boy sitting next to me muttered, "Good luck," in my ear. He looked at me almost sheepishly, and I felt a pang of empathy. I knew what it felt to be treated like you were contagious. He was nervous and ducked his head to avoid making eye contact with me. "His dad's rich. I mean, mega rich," Carly spoke with a mouthful at the lunch table, relishing the words more than the food. "You'd think that would be good, right?" She rolled her eyes. "But he's also super shady. My parents told me to stay away from him, and I just made sure everybody else knew." Her pigtails shook with excitement that she had somebody new to tell. "So, now you know, right?" I chewed the hockey puck burger that was lunch and thought, "Now I know," I echoed. When I invited Jason around, he thought I was joking. I assured him I wasn't. And even when he rang the doorbell on my front porch, he looked like he was in the wrong place. My mother put down a plate of lasagna in front of him, and he ate like he was starving. It took him 3 weeks of coming around my house for him to realize that I wasn't trying to prank him. We were playing video games in my room, and he turned to me and blurted out, Thank you for this. I don't want to be ungrateful. It's just that this has happened before and... He broke off, his ears turning red. Come round mine next. I've got a big screen. Jason's big screen covered the entire wall. The house was so large, it had an elevator to the top floor. It was floors on floors of marble and mounted heads of elephants and lions on the wall. His dad was a big collector of exotic animals, apparently, and the house looked like a museum for it. The best thing, Jason told me happily, is down in the basement. It was an aquarium. Not just an aquarium, an endless tangle of corridors and tanks with fish that glittered under neon lights. Some I'd never seen before, and I hesitated back when we looked over the top of the shark tank and I saw a shadow twice my size lurking in the depths. Going to see the aquarium was one of my favourite things, but never when Jason's dad was there. He had a strange demeanour, and Jason cowered when he was in the room. One day, Jason told me there was something special in the aquarium, something new that I hadn't seen before. He was practically shaking from excitement. Come over after school, I mean it, you won't want to miss it. I sat through the day, nervous, my leg hitting the desk as I bounced it under the table. We walked through the fields to get back, and the more we discussed it, the more I had a feeling something was terribly wrong. Jason licked his palm and slicked back his hair. It was an out-of-place gesture, one that his father sometimes made. My dad says it's dangerous, that whatever I do, I can't touch it. We weren't even supposed to be down there. His voice suddenly had a conspiratory tone, and I hated it. I didn't want to be a part of whatever was going on in his head, especially if it involved ticking off his dad. Maybe I should get going. I tried to laugh it off. Pretty sure my parents want me back. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. You'll never see anything like her again. The barrier I'd put in my head against it suddenly shifted. Her? I paused. She looks just like a girl. She's naked. He half whispered the last sentence, grinning at me like a Cheshire cat. The room was in the back, where I had never been before. We wove through the mazes of anglers with their horrible, gaping mouths open, angelfish floating through the halos of their tank spotlights. This tank was dark. I shivered in the cold steel-beamed room, and Jason busied himself with a light switch, struggling to drag down the lever. My eyes strained into the pitchy black water, and a shiver went down my spine. Got it! Jason wrenched down the switch with a heavy clank that made me jump, and a small, milky spotlight came from the bottom of the tank. My heart almost stopped when I saw a girl floating in the grey, her hair floating like seaweed around her face, so long it filled the tank like a hazy halo. My mouth struggled to form words. Jason dragged me up the steps and I let him, numb in shock, until we looked over the edge into the murky water. The floor creaked below us and the girl floated, her pale blue lips moving. A mermaid. My dad says I get to have her on my 16th birthday. His voice was low with trepidation. I can't wait. The mermaid moved, twitched, as if having a bad dream. A small noise, the creaking of wood, the lapping of water, appeared deeper, and my head buzzed as I saw the lacerations on her body. Don't worry, he says she loves it. Jason, I whispered, hoarse. This isn't right. The mermaid's eyes shot open, her eyes glowing like twin moons, and Jason jumped back with a yell. My limbs felt like they were in a dream as I moved towards the tank, and I felt the wet floor soak through my jeans as I knelt over the water. The mermaid's face grew closer and closer to the surface, and Jason's shouts faded out to crackling white noise. Her small fingertips breached the surface, and I gasped in one breath. I was airborne and fumbling forwards and forwards endlessly until the deafening crash of the water dragged me under. The mermaid's hair curled around me, and for a moment the constriction made me panic, my lungs screaming against the lack of oxygen, a rotted face aligned next to mine, so different from the one I had seen above the water, and I could feel the bubbles hit my nose as I screamed my last breath. Then, there was nothing. It was all gone. My fear had been removed suddenly from me, like throwing up after hours of sickness. The face was no longer death-like, but was now faces of women, maybe 5 or 10 or 1,000. They drifted in front of me, and I knew I should have been afraid. But an incredible aching sadness was all that was left in me. Here she was, locked up like an animal. All that was left of her was slavery. Her sisters screamed out to her in the depths, and I saw their twisted mouths opening and shutting. The visions of Jason's father were of him lifting her out of the tank with a machine that cut into her skin, a dart in her neck seeping the strength from her bones. In some of them, his friends were there, and the smell of alcohol was like napalm, but the water was nowhere to be found, and she gasped out, asphyxiating. The discomfort grew, and I struggled in the water, trying to get the words out as my limbs moved unbearably slow. I am not one of them. In my ears, the ocean wailed, and I felt her struggling to reach out back to it. In the briny darkness, nothing but thin streams of silver bubbles came out of my mouth. I remembered how I felt at the idea that a woman could be down here, helpless and unable to prevent 2 boys gawking at her, and the regret, the shame overwhelmed me. I reached out, desperate, and caught something. The girl's hair, crimson, wrapped around my wrist, but it was not to constrain me. She held them and guided them until they touched the cold, hard mirror. For a moment, we looked at our reflections, a girl and boy floating in infinite starry water. Then her hand slipped into mine, and I knew it wasn't a mirror. With one finger, I touched the glass in the tank, and I don't know how it was possible, but the faintest thread of a crack appeared in front of me. I felt the hands of them all, the hands of the 1,000 in my hand, and I closed my eyes and tapped the glass. We spilled head over tail, the world turning upside down. The unearthly scream of her joy as she fell. My own howl of pains as the glass of the shattered tank went into my leg. It all faded until nothing was left but silence. I turned and saw Jason, his face red and swollen from his tears. We were alone in the aquarium again, nothing but the drip of water as it fell from the remnants of the tank. The mermaid was gone, and we sat in silence for a while, wondering what we had done. 3 days later, Jason's father went missing. He'd been a well-known figure in the area, so much so that it hadn't been a surprise to the police investigating it. Jason told me they were shocked it had taken this long for it to happen. Both he and the men who had been with him, strange mugshots that seemed familiar, even though they shouldn't have been, and had been found mostly in pieces. That night, I found a dark stone under my pillow, and I woke up with the smell of salty air in my nose. I think sometimes about what I saw when I was down in the water with the girl, and I think about the things she showed me in those horrible, murky depths. Sometimes I think she was too kind. Have you ever known someone that considered you their best friend, even though to you, they were barely more than an acquaintance? When I was a kid, that friend was Henry. I was always nice to him when I saw him in class, but we never really spent time with each other outside of school. That's why I was so surprised when he asked me to come spend the night at his house for his birthday celebration. To say that it was awkward would be putting it mildly. I was either the only guest invited or the only one that actually showed up. His father, who I learned was raising Henry as a single parent, was a large but quiet man. After he dropped the store-bought cake onto the kitchen table, Henry and I were pretty much left to our own devices. Henry was a big horror fan. He showed me his room that was covered in posters of the Wolfman and Dracula. He had stacks of worn-out EC comics in every corner of the room. Instead of playing with G.I. Joes, he had me playing with a Barbie doll while he chased her with some alien creature action figure. It wasn't my favourite birthday. When the hour got late, Henry's dad told us to shut off the light and go to bed. I couldn't have been happier. I was ready for this night to be over with. But naturally, Henry had other ideas. Within seconds of his father's footsteps fading away, Henry had a flashlight in hand and was ready to start telling scary stories. Henry told me about the time his dad was attacked in the woods by a deformed humanoid creature. The monster pounced on him and started to claw at his face, but he was able to overpower it and crush its windpipe. But the creature kept coming back. The monster could show up at any moment and attack Henry's dad. Every time the outcome was the same. Henry's dad was able to overpower and kill the monster, only for it to rise up again and attack him later. Eventually, the monster followed him back to their house. It waited as the family slept and attacked at night. The monster killed Henry's mother before his dad was able to strike it down. Henry's dad set him down and tried to explain about the monster, how there was no way to stop it from coming back and that it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything from him. So he had no choice but to lock it up in the basement. He warned Henry to never go into the basement because he might actually let the monster out. The whole story was pretty corny. Henry seemed annoyed when I laughed and told me how it was all true. He tried to goad me into going into the basement if I thought he was lying. Luckily, Henry's dad banged on the door at that moment and told us to quiet down and go to sleep. I gladly rolled over and shut my eyes. A few hours later, I awoke to a full bladder and awkwardly felt my way along the dark hallway to try find the bathroom. After I flushed and washed my hands, I made my way back to Henry's bedroom. I stopped, dead in my tracks, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs behind the door to the basement. Henry's story may have been stupid, but when you are all alone in the dark in an unfamiliar house, it starts to come true. A silly story starts to sound a lot more plausible. So, I just stood there, perfectly still, and listened as the footsteps got closer and closer to the top of the stairs. Something behind the door latched onto the doorknob and started to wiggle it back and forth. Slow at first, but it quickly became more frantic. The door began to heave in and out as the monster behind the door tried to rip it open. The beast that previously tried to stay very quiet no longer seemed to care. I could hear its inhuman, zombie-like moans as it put every ounce of strength into opening that locked door. I ran as fast as I could to Henry's dad's room. I was talking a mile a minute as I tried to explain to him that the monster was trying to get out of the basement. He practically had to shake some sense into me to get me to talk in a comprehensible manner. When he finally realized that I was trying to warn him that the monster was about to escape the basement, his eyes went wide. He told me to stay in his room and lock the door. I could see it in his face. The fear in that grown man's eyes left no doubt that Henry's story was all real. I waited, hiding under the blankets in that room for what seemed like hours before he returned, along with his son. Henry's dad told me to come out to the kitchen, where we could have some more cake and he would explain everything. It turned out that it was all a dumb prank. Henry had snuck out of the room when he heard me leave to go to the bathroom. It was him hiding in the basement door, making scary noises and pretending like he was coming to rip me limb from limb. His dad made him apologize and promised to never scare me like that again. I felt like an idiot. Henry's story was so stupid, and yet I had completely fallen for his prank. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Henry and I kind of drifted apart after that. I never really considered him much of a friend to start with, so it wasn't all that difficult to start to push him away after that disaster of a birthday sleepover. In fact, Henry started to drift away from pretty much everyone after that. A few years later, we entered high school, and he never fell in with any of the cliques. When I went away to college, I started to forget all about my short-lived friendship with Henry. That's what made it all the more weird to receive a call from him last month, completely out of the blue. We hadn't spoken since high school. He told me how he had been in a car accident and was in the hospital. He wondered if I could visit. I felt terrible. I hadn't so much as thought of Henry in over a decade, but clearly he still considered me a friend after all these years. Reluctantly, my guilt about pushing him away made me agree to go visit him. He looked horrible. Plaster cast on both legs and one of his arms. It would be a long time before he left a wheelchair. I sat with him for an hour, but most of that was spent in silence. It didn't take long to catch up. There just wasn't that much to talk about. In my eyes, we were never that close, and time had only deepened that gap. Henry still lived in the same house. His father had willed it to him when he died shortly after we graduated high school. Henry said he would need some help taking care of the place for a little while after he got released from the hospital. Again, I felt horrible. He clearly had no one in his life. A mere acquaintance from childhood was the only person he could ask to help him in this time of desperate need. How could I say no? So, a few days later, I drove back to the hospital and picked him up. I awkwardly lifted him into my car and folded up the wheelchair so it would fit in the boot. Already, I felt like I had bitten off more than I could chew. How long was I expected to help him out? His house was a total wreck. It needed a new paint job, countless hours of yard work, and a new roof. It practically looked abandoned. Once inside, Henry had me take him to the kitchen, where he immediately had me open several large cans of food and slide the contents out into 2 bowls. I told him I wasn't hungry, and kind of joked that he should want something with a little more taste, having been stuck with hospital food for days. But he insisted. So I heated up the bowls and brought them back to the table. Naturally, I wasn't digging in, but I was surprised that Henry just stared at the bowl as well. He seemed lost in thought. almost like he forgot I was even there. The whole thing was very off-putting, and I found myself over and over looking to the clock and hoping that I could get away soon. Eventually, Henry broke the silence. To my surprise, he brought up that night, his birthday celebration, the last time I had been here. He asked me if I remembered that, like I could ever forget. So I just laughed and lied about what a great time I had. Then he asked if I remembered the monster in the basement. All these years, and it seemed that Henry hadn't changed at all. For a split second, it even crossed my mind that all of this was just an elaborate plan to prank me again. That he had friends ready to burst out of his basement and spray me with silly string just so Henry could laugh at me once more. But Henry was dead serious. He couldn't even lift his head to look me in the eyes as he continued to talk. He told me that the monster was real, and it was hungry. Henry had been at the hospital for a while. It had been far too long since the monster had fed. The bowls of canned food that Henry had me prepare weren't for us. He wanted me to take them downstairs. I was dumbfounded. Did he really think I was this stupid? I didn't even bother to answer him. I just stood up, grabbed my keys, and prepared to leave. If this was how Henry was going to reward my kindness, I wouldn't feel bad about abandoning. But Henry grabbed my wrist as I tried to walk away. He looked up at me with tears forming in his eyes and lips quivering as he begged me to take the food down to the basement. Please take the food down. I'll explain everything when you come back up. It'll make more sense if you see it first. Something in my mind told me I needed to do this. I wasn't afraid to go back to that basement door that had terrified me so many years ago, but I still needed closure. I needed to see that Henry was full of it, and there was nothing but a normal old basement behind that door. I wheeled Henry over to the basement door, and he unlocked it. He waited by the top of the staircase as I opened the door and started to descend. The smell was overwhelming. Not just mildew or mold like you would expect from an old dank basement. It was a living smell. Sweat, feces, human filth. Something was down there. I slowly made my way down the stairs. The sights and sounds of that childhood night flooded my brain as I heard my own footsteps mimicking the sound of the monster from years ago. This time, I traced the monster's steps in reverse as I practically tiptoed my way down the stairs with my shirt raised around my nostrils to try and keep the smell at bay. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. Saw them. Huddled in a dark corner at the far end of the basement. I dropped the bowls of food, and they clattered on the concrete floor, alerting the others to my presence. They barely had the strength to lift their heads and look upon me. Their skin was stretched tight from starvation, revealing the curve of every bone on their body. Their heads were nearly bald from malnutrition, and they were covered in scars. They looked every bit the monster that Henry had described to me that night so many years ago. But now I knew better. They were human. Beaten, abused and tormented, but just as human as I was. Slowly, they crawled towards me. I was still frozen. It was just like when I was a child. They clawed their way across the floor, but their outstretched hands weren't coming for me. They wanted the food that was spilled around my feet. The chains that were latched tightly around their ankles stopped them well before reaching. I looked in horror at the scars of years of struggling against those chains had created. The skin, all the way up one of their legs, was red with infection. But they didn't stop trying. They stretched and pawed at the ground, trying to get just a little bit closer to the food that was beyond their grasp. I'm ashamed to admit that I backed up and started to run up the stairs. I was stopped when they started moaning, identical to that sound I heard behind the door when I was a child. I turned and looked and saw their pleading faces, their mouths empty of tongue and teeth. When I turned back around, Henry was staring down at me from the top of the staircase. He had his one good hand latched tightly around the door, ready to slam it shut. "Finish feeding them," he said coldly. I stood there, still frozen, but my mind was racing. I wasn't terrified at what I saw down there, but by Henry. He was the true monster here, not these things he kept locked up in the basement. But right now, Henry was no threat to anyone. Henry must have seen it in my face. He was used to controlling this pair of captives, and didn't like seeing the look of defiance on my face. He quickly slammed the door shut, and I could hear him struggling with the key as I sprinted up the stairs 2 steps at a time. I launched my shoulder into the door, knocking Henry over and spilling him out onto the floor before he could lock me down there in his basement. The moans in the captives from the basement still echoed behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight out the front door and immediately called the police. Henry was surprisingly forthcoming when they interrogated him. He hadn't planned on locking me down there with them. He wanted me to join them, to become part of this, just like he had done when his father had first shown the basement and its captives to him so many years ago. It turns out that the monster in the basement was his father's own rage. His father had held kidnapped girls in the basement for decades. Abusing them allowed him to keep his monstrous side safe and hidden from the world. When Henry was old enough, he recognized the monster inside of him and allowed Henry to join him in that basement. Henry hadn't planned on adding me to his list of captives. He wanted me to join him as his new partner while he recovered from his injuries. I am tormented by my memory of that night, the sleepover at Henry's house. Even though I eventually became their savior, I'll never be able to forget that I am directly responsible for preventing their escape all those years ago. I doomed them to decades more time, trapped as captives in that basement, because when I heard them, I ran and alerted their captor. I allowed the monster to continue and thrive in that basement. To start off, I'm not a believer in anything paranormal, magical, voodoo-y, hoodoo-y, none of that stuff. The extent of my creepy ghost-like or urban legend experience until now had been through my friends, and most of them chalked it up to the usual. It was a cougar or fox scream, not a woman's. The wind did that. It was just a messed up homeless guy stalking me, and then left it at that. But I cannot logically explain to myself what I just witnessed in any terms other than saying it was unnatural at best or terrifyingly unworldly at worst. So, this all happened just a few hours ago when I decided to do something different after work and take a hike by this little park my shop is by. I'm a mechanic. It's something my wife loves to do, and I decided I'd take the same trails she likes to go on. Now, the thing about the park is that it's basically just an office, some roads to look at scenery, and a place to fish and dock boats in the lake nearby. But after that, it's mostly trails. The trails only go out into the woods about 10 miles, and after that, it's about 1,000 acres of no man's land woods and blind cliffs owned by the state. People get lost, go missing, and die all the time because the dumbasses think they can rough it, and my wife has had her own stories of going off trail for a second and getting instantly turned around. In my college days, I used to do the same, but not anymore since I've had my fair share of getting scared witless after getting lost in places like that. It's by the grace of God I could always find my way back, but it's never a wise thing to do, even if you are confident in your own navigation skills. I think you get the picture of the place I was in. When I get there and I'm parked, I decided that I'd take one of the relatively shorter routes, 2-mile round trail, since it had been a while since I hiked the trails and didn't have any gear on me, plus it would get dark soon. I grabbed a map from the office right by the start of all the trails on the off chance I got lost or something, and thank God I did. I was pretty confident that getting lost wouldn't be that big of a deal anyway, since one of the longer trails, also a round trail, about 10 miles around made for camping on, went all the way around the parking lot, and my trail with my car basically being the dead center of the thing. When in doubt, I could just walk in any one direction and find it and get back home. So, starting off the hike, I wasn't worried. Just ready to get some walking in and then brag to my wife how I finally went out to her favorite place. I'd say I was even excited. The weather was amazing. The wind was at just the right speed, and I would have something to talk about. I'd say I was about a quarter mile in before things got a little weird. It wasn't that there was anything visibly off or anything, just that I started to feel uncomfortable, kind of like a nagging feeling in the back of my mind saying, "You should probably leave." I had already started and really didn't feel like turning around, so I kept going, looking at wildlife, enjoying the view when I could, and generally taking it slow. But that feeling never did go away. It was at the halfway point at what my map said was the crest of the trail that feeling got overwhelming. It was suffocating, like my whole body just wanted to up and run out of the perfectly fine looking trail. But I had already come so far, there was no use in turning around since I was at the halfway point. I thought maybe I was just getting freaked out since I hadn't done it in a while, or maybe I was just having a panic attack from all the stress I'd been under the past few days. So I decided to sit down and take a breather to calm myself down. It didn't. Around 5 minutes into me flipping through my phone and reading some random Reddit stories, I noticed how damn quiet the woods had gotten. The air was dead. There was literally nothing. You ever heard the phrase, "silence can be deafening"? Well, in that moment, it was so quiet. I swear to God, I could hear the blood flowing in my head. It hurt it was so silent, and it unnerved me to no end. So, I did what any husband does. I called my wife for guidance. The conversation went something like this, at full speaker volume since I was so desperate to clear the air. "David, what's going on?" She knew something was up because I rarely ever called, even for emergencies. "Hey, don't worry, I'm gonna be late because I decided I was gonna hike the 2-mile loop today, but I had a question for you. What does it mean when the woods get suddenly quiet?" She went silent for a bit, freaking me out more. "Where are you on the trail? How far in?" "About a mile. Why?" "I want you to get up, grab a big rock or a sharp, long stick or something, and finish the trail as quickly as possible. But don't run. It's quiet because there's a predator around. Maybe a bear or a cougar. Something big at least. I don't want to freak you out, but I want you to know that it probably already knows you're there, and if it's a cougar, it's probably been following you. Make it know you're there, and don't run. Stand your ground. I'll drive up the trail and meet you when you get out." And she hung up before I could probably freak the hell out. Rather than puking up my anxiety or running as fast as I could, I got a stick, broke some of it off so it'd be sharp, and sent a quick "I love you, thanks" text to my wife. Our house is closed, so I knew she'd be there in about 15 or so minutes, but it didn't calm me down, not at all. For the next half hour, I had slowed down to about a crawl as I looked around for whatever could be near me. All the while, the woods were still quiet. At that point, I was so anxious I wanted to barf, and I might have if I wasn't so paranoid that closing my eyes for just a second would alert whatever was making the woods so quiet to attack. So I just went on, looking over my shoulder every few seconds and stopping to strain my ears to hear if there was anything walking around me. For a long stretch of time, there wasn't. Still no sound, still no wildlife, still nothing. Just my heart racing. But as I went on the trail into some of the thicker parts of the woods, I began to notice my footsteps seemed to echo, ever so slightly. It was hardly noticeable, and had I not been so on alert, I would never even registered it. But once I heard it, it was deafening. When I stopped and checked behind me though, there was nothing. At first, I thought I'd just gotten so worked up I was hearing things, that the quiet was messing with my head and my brain got bored. So I tried to ignore it. But after a while, I just couldn't. It was so unnerving that I started to play with it. I quickened my pace ever so slightly. Stop, go nearly into a full sprint, and every time, an almost perfectly in-time replica would follow. I hated every second of it. It felt so unnatural that I could feel my body begging me to just book it. But I couldn't. If it really was a cougar, I'd be dead. So I tried one last effort to really see if it was in my head or not. I took a few normal steps, then acted like I was about to put my foot down before I stopped just above the leaves. Crunch. I had never gone so still in my life. I couldn't breathe as the sound of that extra footstep just echoed in my brain. And somehow, I knew, just damn knew, deep down, despite never being involved with this type of stuff, that whatever it was behind me wasn't natural. For the longest time, I couldn't move, and sure as hell didn't want to look behind me. My 5'3" looking ass wouldn't last a second, and I really didn't want to mess my already pea-filled overalls. After what must have only been a few seconds now that I think about it, I started walking again, faster this time. The echo admittedly didn't return, but I still had a suffocating sense of dread and terror pumping in my veins. I only had a quarter mile left to go, and I was sure as hell ready to get the hell out of that place. I wasn't any less scared than I was, but at least I still had the solace of being in one piece and being one step closer to my wife, and probably our shotgun if she had the sense to grab it, and she probably did. I thought it was over at this point, and that it was just going to be a moment of me having a freak out moment and laugh about it tomorrow, and after a few minutes of being footstep free and hearing my wife call my name a little ways up the trail, the relief that washed over me had me thinking just that. I had been walking slower than usual, so I wasn't shocked that she had come to meet me on the trail. From the exit, it would have only been a 15-minute walk at a breakneck pace, and she was the type of person to meet you if you were freaked out, even in the middle of nowhere. What else was I supposed to suspect? So, I keep on walking and hear her call me again. I reply with some, "I'm coming, I'm here, I'm safe" lines and keep on following the trail. There was nothing that threw me off, not a single thing. So, I just kept going. The only thing that I detected was off was that no matter how much further I got, her voice didn't get any louder. It was odd, but I thought maybe she was trying to lead me to the exit, or thought I went off trail or something. And when I heard her voice subtly switch from in front of me to my left, those suspicions were answered. At least, they were for a split second. I was bleary from all that fear. I knew that. And when I remembered who the hell was calling for me, I knew for a goddamn fact that that woman had learned a lesson on getting lost in the woods. The last time had been nearly over a year ago, and she was lost for nearly a whole night. She didn't go hiking for a few months after that, she was so shaken up, and had to go to therapy for weeks because of it. She loved me, but she wouldn't go into the woods for me. Not again. But who the hell else could it be? So, for a second, I just listened as a voice subtly got closer, still calling my name. The more I listened, the odder I noticed that it was. It was the same. Every single time she said it, it sounded exactly the same. Same intonation, same speed, everything. No other words, but my name. None. And it kept getting closer. "Hon, is that you? Answer me, yes or no?" I don't know why I asked that. Honestly, I don't. But I'm sure as hell glad I did. For about a second, it stopped. Back to that silence, and I thought my heart was going to implode from the anticipation. Jesus, it nearly did, when I heard the most blood-curdling, bloody murder pain scream I'd ever heard from a woman's mouth. It just kept going and going and going. There was only a stop, like for a gasp of air, but the sound never weakened or broke like anyone in pain would. It was just an ongoing sound that paused for a second, then kept going. And in my panic, I booked it as fast as I possibly could because of all the things I knew and didn't. That thing wasn't my wife. Running at the speed I was, and in the hurry, I didn't even notice when I went off trail since they weren't well cleared during this time of year, and I didn't know I was lost until I knew I should have been out of the woods. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to turn around and run back because that thing was still screeching, and it still wasn't getting any farther or closer to me. I could see it from the tears in my eyes as I just kept running, bolting until my legs were nearly about to collapse, and my lungs felt like they were being stabbed. I hadn't even been gone for a full 5 minutes before I had to stop, with that screeching still behind me. There was nothing I could do. I was in the middle of a gigantic forest. I had dropped my stick, and something that wasn't a cougar or a bear or a fox was following me. That 10-mile loop was at least a mile or two away from where I had ran, and if that was my only bet, it would be dark by the time I found it. It didn't matter since I was out of breath. All I could do was hide. Since the trails themselves could get pretty craggy when they weren't all forest, I raced to find myself some rocks and ended up squeezing myself between them. Thinking back now, it was the stupidest thing I could have chosen to do. But in that moment, it was the best I had. I sat between those rocks, holding my breath, sweating up an anxious, smelly storm as my bug eyes looked around what little I could see from my hiding spot. The screaming never did stop, but the footsteps returned. It was a very quiet, very subtle crunch, so predatory in nature, I wanted to cry. Probably would have, won't lie. But I think the worst part of it all, the part that may never leave my mind, is that as that thing's footsteps moved right behind the back of my rock that totally covered me, that screaming never got any louder. Even when it was right behind me, the screaming stayed the exact same volume until, out of nowhere, it just stopped on a dime. I heard the footsteps explore around for a long, long time, but eventually, they too went far enough away that I couldn't hear them. I didn't dare leave my hiding spot for what I determined was about an hour, trembling and light-headed as it got darker. When I finally pried myself from between the rocky cheeks that saved my ass, for that moment, I walked as quietly as I could towards the 10-mile loop, hoping to find it and some campers before dark. I made it to the trail just after dark after exploring for 2 hours and found a ranger's cabin just a little ways from where I started on it. She had been just getting the missing persons call from my wife when I knocked on a door, pale as a ghost, scared as hell. Before she took me back, which was a thankfully short drive on her four-wheeler, I asked if I could use a toilet and threw up more violently than I had in my whole life. She didn't ask me what happened, just took me back, and on the whole way from the cabin to parking lot, holding on to her a lot more tightly than someone with dignity should, I had the distinct feeling of being watched. My wife nearly sobbed when she saw me. 5 hours later to the parking lot than I was meant to be. The cops and the ranger checked me over and determined that, though shaken up, I was fine. Her and I left, and she pulled into the nearby gas station to calm herself down as she looked me over, utterly silent. "I thought you had gotten attacked by a cougar or something, David." All I could say was, "It wasn't a cougar." The silence that she gave me then, the look on her face as she just stared at me, will never leave my mind before she said something freakier than I could manage to describe what I had just been through. I know. I just got home an hour ago, and I haven't spoken to my wife about it any further. We've just been quiet. I still have sticks in my hair, but I'm terrified to be alone. What the hell did I just witness? I've lived in Arizona for the past 15 years of my life, but I had a very different life before that. I used to live in a small town in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't even tell you what side of the country it's on, or if it's even in the United States. It was a small forest town with dense trees in all directions, but where exactly this particular forest is, well, your guess is as good as mine. The only thing I know for certain is the name of the town, Point Pine. I lived in Point Pine for the first 10 years of my life, before we moved the summer after my 10th birthday. Once we left, my parents never spoke of it again. In fact, they acted as if it never even existed. And to them, I guess it didn't. I don't really blame them either. I caught on pretty quickly and realized that they were trying their hardest to forget the memory of Point Pine. Whenever kids at school asked me where I was from, I simply told them I was from a small town they had never heard of. I also learned early on that any questions about Point Pine would be met with punishments. A few months after we moved to Arizona, my older sister, Felicity, had a school project about family history. She did it on our life in Point Pine and wrote about some of the things she remembered from there. Our mom found her project the day before she turned it in and burned it in the backyard. When Felicity came home that afternoon, my parents took her up to her bedroom, where I heard Felicity crying out every few minutes in what I assume was pain. I said nothing, and from that moment on, neither of us mentioned Point Pine again. Except for me, right now. I've decided to tell all of you about it. I don't know what is causing me to remember all these things that I had locked up in the deepest part of my brain. Maybe it's the fact that my father died about a week ago. Since he died, my mom has remained silent, hasn't said a word to anyone. She hasn't even cried. In fact, she ended up sending my father's remains off to God knows where. My money is on Point Pine, although I'd be crazy to ask. I've started recalling random little things about the town that, at the time, seemed like normal, everyday things that we as residents were all used to. Now, as I look back, I realize that they're not as normal as I thought back then. One peculiar thing about Point Pine had to be the Point Pine Bakery. Whenever you went in there, the owner, Mr. Terrence, always knew what you were about to order. I remember the kids having some sort of rumor about Mr. Terrence being a magician who could read minds. Also, whenever you paid for your baked goods, you had to tip Mr. Terrence with an old item of clothing that you had grown out of. There was a giant box up by the register that everyone tossed old baby clothes and shoes into. That was one of the odd things, although you'll come to realize that it won't seem that weird in comparison to some of the other things about Point Pine. Every year on your birthday, you had to get blood work done. I don't think anyone really knew what the point of this was, or if they were actually looking for something. We just all knew that our birthdays would start off with a trip to the Point Pine labs. Everyone had to be up at 8:13 a.m. There was a system of speakers placed around the town like an amusement park or something, and at 8:13 a.m., without fail, the wailing alarm sound would ricochet through the neighborhoods, waking everybody up. This was followed by parents running to wake up their children and get them out of bed as quickly as possible, like the house was on fire or something. Sometimes I expected it to be. All the Point Pine schools were placed in different areas of the town. Point Pine Middle School was in the west, Point Pine High School was in the dead center of town, and Point Pine University was up on a small hill towards the south. If you hadn't noticed by now, every place in town was named Point Pine something. The Point Pine Cafe, Point Pine Mall, Point Pine Grocery, etc., etc. Certainly, one of the weirdest things by far that took place in Point Pine was the Point Pine Monthly Parade. It happened every month without fail. It was never on the same day, and each month, a student from Point Pine High was chosen to be in it. The weird thing about this parade was that we weren't allowed to watch it go by. Not out on the streets, not from the windows, and not even on television. That was one of the most enforced rules. You must never, under any circumstance, look at the parade. In fact, for the most part, we weren't even allowed outside when the parade passed through. We always knew when the parade was about to start, because it always happened the same way. You would hear a chorus of voices, like a church choir, singing a medley. It wasn't a familiar one that I knew. I was only familiar with it in the sense that I heard it once a month. It sounded like it could be from a nursery rhyme or something similar. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. It was like they were coming from the sky, the ground, the trees, the buildings, like everything on Point Pine was singing. Once you heard the first note, you had 5 minutes to get inside a house or a building that had locks on the doors. This might come as a surprise, but in Point Pine, not many buildings contained locks. So, if you happened to be out and about on the street when the singing started, you had about 3 options on the places you could go. One of the schools, the staff break room in the Point Pine bar, or the fridge in the Point Pine pizza shop. One year in the month of August, my friend Lee and I decided that we were going to break the rules and not go inside when the parade passed. Now that I think about it, I'm surprised that the kids didn't do this more often, considering that, well, when you tell kids that they must absolutely never do something, they often do that exact thing. Since we didn't know when the parade was coming, where it started, or the exact path it took around town, we decided the smartest thing to do would be to wait for it in the forest near the Point Pine Library until the parade eventually came down that street. So, we basically decided to spend about half of the month of August hanging out near or around the library. Around the 3rd week of the month, while we were sitting on the steps of the library talking about some random things that aren't important, we heard the music start. Lee and I looked at each other and then took off running into the trees, while everyone else raced to the nearest school. We went far enough into the forest that someone on the street wouldn't see us, but stayed close enough so that we were able to see a part of the road. We waited for a while, whispering to each other and then shushing one another as we waited for the infamous parade to pass. This year, my sister's friend Reed was chosen to work on the parade. She was a few years younger than my sister, but they were friends because Reed used to live next door to us when we were younger. We were crouching in the bushes and leaves when we heard the chorus of voices getting louder and therefore closer. "Dude, I totally see it," Lee hissed. I straightened my back a little in my crouched position to try to see what Lee was seeing. I was always short as a kid. Even now I'm shorter than most guys my age, or any age really. So Lee always pretty much towered over me. "I can't see anything," I hissed, shifting my position. "Shush, they might hear us," Lee whispered. I stopped moving and instead waited for them to get closer, where they were bound to pass right in front of my line of sight. "Oh no, oh crap." Suddenly, Lee dove to the ground, landing in a fetal position, with his head cradled in his hands. "What?" I asked, looking from him to the street. "I saw her. I saw that girl," he exclaimed. "Reed?" I asked, looking over to try to spot her. Lee grabbed me and slammed me down to the ground. "Ow!" I exclaimed. "What was that for?" I asked. "You don't want to look at it," he replied. I noticed that for the first time in all of the years that I had known him, Lee looked absolutely terrified. I turned my back on the parade and sat down to look at Lee instead. "What did you see?" I whispered. "Those things. They did something to her. They're eating her, Cody, but she doesn't even care." I looked at Lee, who still had his head in his hands, and he was crying now. I sat with my back to the parade, no longer wanting to see. I heard the singing get louder. "Cody," I heard the voices calling. "Don't look," Lee whispered. "Cody, Cody." Now the voice sounded like Reed. "Look at us, Cody." I shut my eyes. The voices went on for a few minutes longer, and at one point, Lee started wailing. I kept my eyes shut the entire time. After that, it moved along and continued its way through town. Once we began to hear everyone come out of their hiding places, I stood up and leaned down to help Lee get up. Once he stood up, he kept his head down. "Lee, what's wrong?" I asked. I could hear him sniffling. "Lee?" He finally responded as he lifted his head. "It took my eyes." I will never forget the dark, bleeding holes in Lee's face and the cuts around his skin. I threw up in the forest for a good 3 minutes before I was able to help lead Lee out of the forest. A few adults saw us and got our parents, who came and got us right away. The day after that, my family moved out of Point Pine. I never knew what became of Lee after that day. Minutes after we left, my parents acted like Point Pine never existed. It was never discussed, and I never had the nerve to ask about Lee again. As far as I know, Lee was the only person who ever saw the parade, and he was never able to see anything else after that. I don't know if Point Pine still exists. I'd like to go check it out again, but even if I knew where it was, or how to get there, I don't think I'd ever go back. I have a feeling that I wouldn't exactly get a warm welcome, although I can't shake the thought that my parents were somehow still connected to the town, even after all those years. I was sipping a beer in the shade when the football bounced into my garden. The thing almost made me jump. I'd had my eyes closed, enjoying the warmth and the birdsong, when it thumped onto the grass 10 meters from where I was sitting. I stared at it and rolled my eyes. Nathan. Sure enough, only a couple of minutes later, the kid appeared. First a mop of yellow hair stuck up over my back gate, and then 2 worried eyes followed. I've lived next to Nathan and his family for a few months now, but I still haven't gotten used to how nervous the kid looks. He's like a little blonde rabbit, one that's never managed to find refuge from the headlights. Nathan didn't see me. I was sat back in the edge of my garden in the shadows of my silver birch. I didn't move as he let himself through the back gate. Cruel, I know, but I thought I'd have some fun with him. Nathan picked his way slowly across the grass. His blue eyes were wide. As I watched, I saw them flickering between the place where his ball had landed and the windows of my house. He was concentrating so hard that he walked straight by me without noticing. Grinning, I stood up. I placed my beer silently on the grass and crept after Nathan. I waited until he'd reached his ball before I spoke. "What do you think you're doing?" I tell you, I wish I had been filming. The kid damn near jumped out of his skin. He spun around on the spot, once again reminding me of a frightened animal, and it was only when his eyes found me that some of the shock drained from his face. He put a hand to his chest and pulled in deep breaths. "Mr. Andrews!" Nathan's face was a pale moon. "You made me jump." I couldn't help but grin. "I can see that. And how many times do I have to tell you to call me Paul, Nathan?" "Sorry, Paul." The kid smiled at me. He seemed to have almost recovered. He was still breathing fast, but some of the colour had crept back into his face. "I didn't see you sitting there. For a minute, I thought..." He trailed off and his eyes left mine. They flicked back to the windows of my house, then down to the football at his feet. He fidgeted. "For a minute you thought, what?" "No, nothing. You just made me jump, that's all." I rolled my eyes. "Come on, Nathan. You've lived next door to me for, what now, 3 months? 4. Right, 4. We've chatted a bunch of times since then too. I know I live on my own and I'm not exactly young anymore, but you can't tell me I'm at the age where kids are starting to get scared of me. I grinned at Nathan to make it clear I was kidding. After a few seconds, he grinned back. Then, his eyes went to the windows of my house again, and his smile faded. It's not you, Paul. It's your house. My house? I followed Nathan's gaze. To be fair, my house does look sort of imposing. It's set at the end of a row of homes in our village, and it's the oldest by quite some way, maybe even 17th century. The place looks its age too. Faded, crumbling bricks, half-rotted wood, dark windows that look ever so slightly like eyes. If I haven't lived there so long, the place would probably give me the creeps too. And I could only imagine what a 10-year-old kid might think of it. Go on then, Nathan. I raised my eyebrows. What do your friends say about my house? He stared up at me with his round eyes, and I smiled back at him. I promise I won't mind. I'm just interested to hear the stories the kids these days come up with to scare themselves. Nathan took a long look at the house, then stared back at me. He lowered his voice, as if scared the building might hear him. Some of the kids I've met say it's a gateway to hell, he whispered. Down in the basement, they say if anyone goes down there, they don't come back. I snorted. Gateway to hell, eh? Well, I have to give you friends credit. That's way more original than the stuff we scared each other when I was young. What else did they say? Nathan's eyes were wide. Well, you know that kid who went missing in the forest a couple of years back? George Willow or something? George Willett. Of course I remembered George. For a while, before the main search had died down, the kid's face had been on the front of every paper. You couldn't get away from it. Right, Nathan continued. Well, you know Tim Castwell, who lives over by the church? He says he knows someone who went to school with George, and they say George sometimes used to go on a bike rides near here. Uh-huh. Yeah, well... Nathan glanced once more at the house, then looked back at me. Tim reckons maybe George heard rumors about the basement too or something. He could have tried to sneak in there and see for himself, maybe. I bit down the urge to laugh. I'm not saying 10-year-old kids aren't subtle or anything, Nathan, but I think I might have noticed if one broke into my house and went rooting around in the basement. Nathan shrugged. Then, a second later, he frowned. So, there is one then? What? A basement. I sighed. Yes, there's a basement. But as far as I remember, it's mainly old boxes and garden tools down there. Not much in the way of fiery portals. I paused and looked around the garden. My deck chair was positioned in the shade of the silver birch, the beer forgotten beside it. I sighed again. I tell you what, I said. Why don't you see for yourself? What? The basement. Why don't I show you how unimpressive it actually is? Then you can spread the word for me. I can't imagine Tim Castwell is going to be breaking in anytime soon, but I know how these ghost stories get started. At least if you tell the other kids how dull it really is, then I won't have to worry about getting a burglar alarm installed. Nathan stared down at the football by his feet. Then he looked up at the house. There was a frown on his face, and I could see him chewing his lower lip. At the very least, it'll give you some points in the playground, I continued. Tim Castwell can tell all the stories he wants, but you're the only one who'll have experienced the horror firsthand. Nathan stared at me. I grinned at him again, and after a few seconds, he smiled back. "You'll have to excuse the mess," I said, skirting some shoes in the hallway and making my way into the living room. I was never the tidiest of people, but I suppose my wife kept me in check. Since she passed away, I've gotten a bit lax with the cleaning. Nathan didn't say anything. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him a couple of paces behind me, his rabbit eyes as wide as ever. He hadn't spoken a word since we walked through the front door. To be fair, there was plenty to distract him. I've always been a bit of a collector. A hoarder, too. It's a dangerous combination. My lounge is stuffed full of antiques and bric-a-brac. Old figurines stared out from dusty shelves. Books are piled up everywhere. The lounge features a large inglenook fireplace, which even includes a stone gargoyle I bought at auction a few years back. The stuff looks impressive, at least in my opinion, but I suppose it does create something of a haunted house effect. "I used to deal antiques," I explained to Nathan. We were at the far end of the lounge now, near the back of the house. I stepped through a door and entered a small hallway. I gave up the selling part, but I guess I never stopped buying. Nathan stayed quiet. I could see his eyes combing the walls, flicking between the cobwebs and the faded black and white photos. I continued past the downstairs bathroom on my left, then paused by a narrow staircase on the right. An old wooden door stood next to the stairs. I pointed it out to Nathan. "Here we are," I said. "That's the door that leads down to the dreaded basement, or to hell if you want to believe Tim Castwell." Nathan stared at it. His face was pale in the darkness of the hallway, but the whiteness of his eyes were bright. It took him a few seconds to find his voice. "This is it?" "What's the matter?" I said. "Not as dramatic as you were expecting?" When Nathan failed to respond, I gestured towards the door again. "Go on then," I said. "Why don't you take a look? There's a short flight of steps that go down, but if you stand at the top, you'll be able to see all you need to see. By which I mean the mountains of boxes and the notable lack of any inferno." I smiled again, but Nathan didn't see. His eyes were locked on the door. He took a step towards it, then another. As he came to a stop in front of the ancient wood, I felt the faint rustle of butterflies in my stomach. How long had it been since I'd been down to the basement? I couldn't remember. The only thing I knew for certain was that the door hadn't been opened in a long time. The wood looked dirty and rotten. Nathan took hold of the handle. His words from earlier suddenly drifted back to me. Some of the kids I've met say it's a gateway to hell, down in the basement. They say if anyone goes down there, they don't come back. Nathan opened the door. It creaked inwards on tired hinges. Darkness loomed beyond it like an open throat. Darkness, but nothing else. I heard Nathan let out a breath as he stood on the top step. "You see," I said to him, "it's just a basement." "I guess." Nathan edged closer to the darkness. He wrinkled his nose. "Although, it does smell kind of..." I stepped forward and shoved him. The kid didn't make a sound. 1 minute he was standing in the doorway, the next he'd vanished into the basement's black mouth like an insect down a plug hole. I heard his body crashing down the steps, followed by a muffled snapping sound as he hit the concrete floor at the bottom. Then, nothing. I stood on the top step, breathing fast. The butterflies in my stomach had multiplied. I could feel my own pulse, beating high in my neck. But the main thing I felt was an old, familiar rush of euphoria. A feeling I hadn't had since the day I met George Willett, over 2 years ago now, but I still remembered it. The kid had caught a puncture outside my house that needed fixing. I'd been only too happy to help him. "Sorry, Nathan." I clicked the switch and the basement flooded with light. I could see the kid's broken body on the concrete below me, a rabbit that had stared into the headlights for too long. It's not what you were expecting, I know, but I can promise you this. You won't be lonely down here. Nathan was the second one I did after my wife died. It was harder at first, working alone, but I got used to it. I adapted. I guess that's all you can do, really. The one thing I always have working in my favor, the one thing that never really changes, is the kids. They're drawn to rumors and ghost stories like moths to a flame. What they don't understand, what none of them ever seem to understand, is that there's no such thing as bad houses. Not in real life. Only bad people. I began to hum as I descended the basement steps. Celeste Montgomery reached out to me 3 months ago and insisted on meeting for an in-person interview. Before we met, she claimed to have pertinent information regarding the bizarre and unexpected closure of Holy Innocents boarding school for girls in upstate New York. We met at Darcy's Pint, a local dive bar just outside of Albany. This was her idea. I entered the tavern at 5 p.m. sharp. Celeste was already waiting for me in a booth near the far corner and was sipping a gin and tonic. Her blonde hair was unkempt and had been hastily put into a bun. She was young and attractive, but her bloodshot, green eyes whispered of the pain she so desperately wished to purge. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet me, Miss Montgomery," I said as I sat down. "Celeste is fine," she replied while taking another drink. "Thanks, Celeste. You can call me John. Do you mind if I record our conversation? I can edit out anything you want to keep between you and I." Celeste looked down at the recorder and back at me. "No problem at all." As the waitress walked by, Celeste motioned for another gin and tonic. She nodded and then asked to take my order. "I'll have a coffee, thanks." I glanced at the empty lowball glass on our table. "Oh, and a shot of Bailey's with it." Celeste smiled at me, just before she began tapping her fingernails on the wooden table. Her chipped, black nail polish suggested this was habitual. I clicked on the recorder and looked up. "Take as long as you need, and start with whatever you feel most comfortable telling me. If you prefer, we can wait to begin." She smiled again with less sincerity and took a deep breath. "I'd rather get right to it, if you don't mind. I guess the best place to start is the beginning, I nodded in agreement. I never wanted to transfer to Holy Innocents, but I didn't have much of a choice. I was a bad kid, I'll admit it. My parents were wealthy and never around. So what do wealthy parents who are never around do with bad kids? They send them to boarding school. "And what year did you transfer?" I asked. Celeste continued. 2006, the beginning of my junior year." The waitress dropped off our drinks, and Celeste quickly grabbed hers before continuing. "Holy Innocents couldn't have been more different from the public school I had transferred from. It was run by 6 Catholic nuns and the dean, Dr. Winters." I took a sip of my coffee. "What were they like? How did they treat you and the other girls?" Celeste's nails tapped faster. "They were strict, really strict. There was a no-nonsense curriculum with harsh punishments. They even had this bizarre form of detention that bordered on abuse. They called it RAG, which stood for repent, and grow. If we talked back to one of the nuns, we weren't allowed to speak for 24 hours. If we got caught sneaking out, we were locked in our rooms all weekend and lost social privileges. The worst was when we cursed or took the Lord's name in vain. The punishment for that was drinking an ounce of vinegar to cleanse our impure mouths. Jesus, I said in surprise. Hey, careful now, Celeste said quickly. I couldn't help but laugh. How about the other girls? Was it hard being a transfer student? Celeste took another drink before answering, and I wonder how many she'd had before I'd arrived. We got along okay. I mean, as good as you would expect a school full of angsty teenage girls to get along with one another. But we all had one thing in common. What's that? I asked. We all hated that place, and that kind of brought us closer together. The type of bond I would expect prisoners to have. That makes sense, I said as I stirred my coffee. Celeste grabbed my arm and stared into my eyes. I know the reason you wanted to speak to me, John. I can assure you, something truly sinister lives within those walls. I leaned in closer. Can you tell me about the first night? She took another deep breath and began. The first night was like all the others, but I happened to be the first victim. Me and my roommate, Claire, were sitting in our dormitory and talking before lights out, like we did every night. We were drinking the last drops of a bottle of scotch I kept hidden under a loose floorboard. We each had 1 or 2 shots before falling asleep, and that's the last I remember of that night. Claire and I both woke up the next afternoon. A few of our classmates were shaking us awake as we had slept through class that day. I was disoriented, sore and naked. I didn't even notice the blood at first. Not until I rolled onto my stomach and the other girls started screaming. Celeste took a long drink, killing the rest of her gin. I noticed her eyes beginning to well up. There were scratches, claw marks to be exact, running down my back, 3-fingered and deep. Claire had matching wounds. After we showered, we realized our identical blemishes had formed inverted crosses on our torsos. I still have the scars. There was more. I could tell I had been violated in other ways. I mean, it's okay, I understand. You don't need to explain, I interrupted. Celeste thanked me and continued. Initially, the nuns and Dr. Winters blamed the other girls for what happened to us, thinking there was some sort of deranged bullying going on. Claire and I pushed our beds together and kept any eye on the door that night. A few days later, hazy memories from that night started to come back to us and sink in. We both remember distinct flashes of red, a skeletal head with horns, and being taken to a dark room. Throughout the next few months, it started happening to the other girls. Always the same. Total memory loss or close to it, and the inverted cross scratches. Parents began pulling their kids out of school, and reporters started pestering the staff. Dr. Winters never let any of them on the property, and even threatened expulsion and lawsuits to any students or parents who talked to the press. A few days later, one of the nuns, Sister Mary, went missing, gone without a trace. Celeste leaned in close and whispered, "And there's more, but I'm going to have to show you." "Show me?" I asked. "You and I are going to break into Holy Innocents tonight." I wanted to laugh again, but the sincere look on her face told me she was serious. I would be lying if I didn't admit that I was excited at the opportunity. To my knowledge, I would be the only reporter to have ever set foot inside the school. "I know the property is for sale and the doors are chained. How do we get in?" I asked. Celeste was clearly excited that I was on board. She downed the rest of her drink as she continued. Trust me, I know the damn place better than most people that built it. I spent a lot of nights exploring vacant rooms, hallways and stairwells. If I remember correctly, there's an entrance at the southeast corner with a faulty lock. I would smoke in the woods late at night and use that door to sneak back to bed. What do you say, John? It's only 20 minutes from here. My heart started to race as a mixture of excitement and fear pulsated through me. With all due respect, Miss Montgomery, do you mind if I drive? Celeste climbed into my car and we hit the interstate. The drive was quiet for the most part. I inquired a few times as to what she was going to show me when we arrived. Each time I asked, she reassured me that it was something I had to witness for myself. Around 7:15 p.m., Holy Innocents came into view. I can confidently say that the pictures do not do it justice. The Victorian monstrosity is nothing short of a castle, complete with turrets, stained glass, and a rather unwelcoming iron gate. A sign near the entrance read that the property had been sold and would be undergoing construction in a few months. Celeste seemed just as surprised as myself. I nearly jumped as Celeste spoke. Turn left up here and follow the back road for a bit. It will lead to a clearing where you can park. We'll be able to walk from there. The gravel clearing was exactly where she had remembered. The sun had completely set by the time we parked and climbed out of the car. Celeste handed me a flashlight from her purse as we walked through the woods towards Holy Innocents, and I knew this was her plan all along. As we reached the end of the tree line and stared at the enormous, barren fortress of a school, my heart began to race. I had to try one more time. Before we go in, will you at least tell me why you have to show me what's in there? Celeste took a deep breath and asked a question that took me by complete surprise. Are you a religious man, John? I've always found it best to answer honestly when taken off guard, so I did. I grew up that way, but I can't say I am anymore. Celeste looked at the school for a moment and back at me. That's what I figured. The reason I have to show you is because you wouldn't believe me if I told you. You're going to have to see what true evil looks like. I knew then it wasn't worth asking anymore. She was set in her ways. I contemplated whether she found it therapeutic to walk the halls with an outsider, or if she just needed the visuals to help tell her complete story. Either way, I didn't have much of a choice but to follow her to the door she so vividly remembered being broken. Sure enough, on the southeast corner of the main building was an old wooden door with an iron knob. Celeste handed me her flashlight before gripping the knob with both of her hands. She turned it slightly until an audible crack broke the quietness of the night, and the door creaked open. A wave of musty air filled my nostrils as we walked inside. The door opened to a narrow, spiraled staircase. Celeste led the way as I studied the stained glass that decorated the walls. The stairs ended at the mouth of a long corridor with 12 doors on each side. These were the dormitories, Celeste said. Mine was the last on the right. I glanced in each room as we passed, and everything seemed relatively untouched. Beds and furniture stood flush against the wall, barren of the items they once held. Nothing was overturned, broken, or out of place. We reached Celeste's old room, and she broke the silence once again as we entered. Sister Mary, the nun that went missing just before the school closed, she was the sweetest to us, despite her intimidating size. She would bring us warm milk before bed and would check on us at the night after the incidents began. Celeste walked to the foot of one of the beds. She would stand here and pray while we slept. Celeste slowly walked to the corner of the room and stood in place. The floors creaked as she shifted her weight. She bent down to lift a board, reached inside, and retrieved an old, empty bottle of scotch. "Bad habits start young, I suppose," she said with a little laugh. Celeste put the bottle and the board back and walked quickly out of the room. "Come on," she said. "It's time to show you." I followed Celeste through the halls. The eyes of saints stared from their canvases as we passed. We walked by the old lecture halls and common rooms, and like the dormitories, they were intact and seemingly untouched. Through winding corridors and staircases, we eventually made our way to the center of Holy Innocents, to the church. The eerie stillness washed over me as I examined the interior with my light. Rows of empty pews and religious statues stood as the only reminder that this sacred place was once full of life. Celeste beckoned me forward as she made her way to the back, towards the altar. Around the right side of the altar stood a single wooden door, out of sight from where the clergy once sat. Celeste turned the handle, and the door opened with ease. We entered a rather cluttered room, complete with excess chairs, a piano, stacks of books, and other miscellaneous storage. I was puzzled. Celeste had led me to a storage room in the back of a church. Just before I opened my mouth to inquire, she spoke. "You know, I always thought the nuns were strange. I'd spy on them a lot. It was pretty much the only entertainment I had since we didn't have TV. They were just different in the way they lived, spoke and acted, especially Sister Mary. She just seemed so fake. Everyone loved her, but I always had this feeling, you know." "Here," she said as she illuminated a large statue of an unknown saint in the corner of the room. "Help me move it." We walked to the side and pushed the massive structure from the wall. I never would have seen it if it weren't for her. The small keyhole at the top right corner. The statue was covering a door that was perfectly constructed to resemble the surrounding white wall. Not only did Celeste know the secret door existed, she somehow had the key in her possession. For whatever reason, I couldn't bring myself to ask why. The only thing on my mind was the set of stairs the door had just opened up to, descending into unknown darkness. As I followed Celeste down the stairs, she spoke again. My theory was that she was a liar. It was confirmed the night I saw her in the kitchen making our warm milk. She had no idea I was spying on her. It seemed normal at first, heating it up and pouring them into individual cups. The cups had our names on them, so we didn't accidentally grab the wrong one. After Sister Mary was finished, I noticed she poured some powder into Katie's cup. As we reached the bottom, the smell hit me and I nearly vomited. Sulfur. Rot. Celeste coughed as well. Our flashlights lit up the room and I looked in horror. It was what I can only describe as a torture chamber. Shackles hung from the ceiling and dark stains covered the stone floor. The walls were decorated in unfamiliar symbols and words. Hung in the corner was a crimson robe, and above it was some sort of horned mask fashioned from a bovine skull. I was in total disbelief. My head spun as my brain attempted to process the information. Celeste spoke again. I waited for everyone to fall asleep and for Sister Mary's routine check-ins. Just as I imagined, she went to Katie's room last. Her roommate had already been pulled out of school by her parents, so she had the room to herself. After 5 minutes or so, Sister Mary pulled a very disoriented Katie from her bed and led her to this place. I followed the entire way, quietly creeping behind them. Sister Mary carried her like she was nothing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She stripped Katie down and chained her to the shackles. I continued to stare at Celeste and listen in silent disbelief. Before Sister Mary started, she went over here. Celeste pointed a flashlight on the far wall. There was a large metal door, securely fastened with a massive iron latch. "Miss Montgomery," I stuttered. "What's behind that door?" It was some sort of, what do you call it? Some sort of shrine or something. All I could see when it was open were the candles, dozens of them, and some sort of thing in the middle. "What kind of thing?" I asked dumbly. Celeste was beginning to cry now. "I'm not sure. It was hard to tell from the candlelight, but Sister Mary, she was talking to it. I couldn't understand what she was saying. We used to study Latin, but I couldn't understand the words, and she was talking so fast. I knew it was my only shot when she was in there, so I did it. I slammed the door closed and locked it." Her sobs became louder. Sister Mary didn't scream or anything. She just laughed. It was a crazy laugh, and didn't even sound like her. I grabbed Katie and got her back to bed. I knew I couldn't tell anyone because they wouldn't believe me. I was the bad kid, and they would trust Sister Mary over me. I looked back to the door. My God, so she's still... Celeste wiped her tears as she tried to keep her composure. "Someone just bought this property. I had to tell someone, and you seem so interested and trustworthy from everything I've read. I wasn't listening anymore. I walked toward the locked chamber and reached for the handle. Celeste ran up to me and clutched my wrist, begging me not to open it. Just as I grabbed the latch, we heard it. Celeste and I jumped back in unison. The faint sound of laughter spilled through the tiny gap between the door and the wall. I looked back and stared at her, all the colour drained from her face, as she whispered to me, "That door has been closed since 2006.